If you're in the early stages of learning how to watercolor, brush control exercises are great to do. Not necessarily because you want to have complete control of your brush, because maybe you don't. Maybe you want to paint more expressively and more loosely, as I enjoy doing, but as a beginning foundation, I think it's really important to become familiar with your supplies, and I think that familiarity allows us to gain confidence in the marks that we put down, whether or not they are expressive or they are detailed and refined. In this video, I've taken a few lessons straight from Brush Control for Beginners, a class inside of my painting community, Paint With Me. This video is really meant to be watched as a paint-along type of lesson or tutorial, so I hope that you grab your supplies and get them out and paint along with me. So let's get started. Before we get started on the exercises, this is what I have set up to do them. I have a single color of paint that I'll be using. This is neutral tint. Then I have my brush, so I'm just going to be using one brush for all of these exercises, but you can apply these exercises to any size brush. So mine is a size 10 round brush. Next up, I have a clean cup of water, a paper towel, and a stack of papers here. And just for reference, my pages are about 5 by 7. So if you want to cut your paper down like this, you can. And the last note is that if you have student grade paper or less expensive paper, this is where I would use it. Before we get started on the brush control exercises, I want to review with you how I hold my brush. Now, I'm going to preface it by saying this might not necessarily be how you hold your brush, because we're all different and there's no right or wrong. I just want to give you a little bit of guidance in case you're at a point where you have no point of reference and you need a little bit of help as to where to start. You might adjust and find what's most comfortable for you depending on how you paint, the types of movements you make, the type of brush you're using, so it all really depends. But if you need a little bit of help, this is how I hold my brush. So I like to hold my brush up from the base of where the hair goes into the brush, about an inch or an inch and a half. And the reason is because I like to be able to touch the tip of the brush, but also press all the way down while still having a comfortable amount of space between my thumb and the paper. You can imagine if I held my brush really close to the tip, perhaps I'd have a lot of control, but it's such a little space for movement. There's not a lot of area to be fluid, and if I use the tip, perhaps I'll get control. But once I press down, my hand is squished against the paper and it has nowhere to move. So up here, I have a little bit more breathing room. I have control, but I can also press down and still move freely. The other thing that I like to do is I like to rest this part of my palm, this bottom part, on the paper. And it gives me stability when I'm seeking control of my brush. So I keep my pinky and the rest of my palm down. It's kind of like a stand or a stable area. I can then move the rest of my fingers around and I can create movement like this, or I can create stability like this and then glide across the paper. So if I go this way, you'll see it looks like this. You can see that this part stays touching while I move the brush. And I can even move the brush up and down as I'm moving away because of that space that I've given between the brush tip and my fingers. I mentioned that I do like to hold it down here when I'm trying to control the brush. What if we want to paint looser? Sometimes people like to hold their brush farther down to give a little bit more movement. You can see you can get a lot of movement, but in that case, then I will lift my hand up and then I have a lot more movement. So there's a variety of things happening depending on what outcome you want for the brush. For these exercises, because we want to learn how to control the brush and manipulate it, then I would tend to advise to stick to being closer towards the bottom. Later on, when you're painting looser or perhaps experimenting, perhaps you're even standing and using an easel and then your wrist is not resting, your palm is not resting, and then you're just painting kind of in the air a little bit, then you don't need as much brush control because your intention is to be loose. For the next exercises, because our intention is to be more controlled and learn how the brush can be manipulated, and I think it's also a comfortable place to start as a beginner is to learn how to actually manipulate and control the outcome of our strokes, we're going to want a little bit more control. So that's why my advice is to hold it a little bit closer to the tip, but leave enough room so that you can still be moving your hand around. You don't have to rest your wrist, but I find personally that resting my wrist gives me more control. If you like to paint with your wrist up, please do so, Or you can experiment and you can see how much control you can get by leaving your wrist elevated versus leaving it down. Again, this is going to differ for all of us. It's going to feel different. It's going to feel awkward for some people and natural for others. So what you're going to try and do is find what feels best for you as you're going through. You may not know for a while, and it might take some time. My best advice is to try, to put down paint to paper, and to see what happens. It's experimentation, it's being curious, and it is adjusting as you go. So let's get started with the brush control exercises. In this exercise, we're going to be painting thin lines, both horizontally and vertically. In watercolor painting, it's not going to be too often that you're going to need to strike a bunch of horizontal lines super consistently and straight. But I think this is a really fun exercise to practice. It helps us get more comfortable with our brush and our tools, and it helps us just practice getting paint onto paper. In this exercise, we're going to be practicing thin lines, both horizontally and vertically. You're going to want paint that is nice and dark, but not too thick. You can see how it moves on the palette like this. It's fluid, but not too watery. It doesn't really matter how dark or light it is. I just want you to be able to see it. I would err on the side of going darker rather than lighter, but again, make sure you're getting enough water mixed with your paint so that it's still moving pretty nicely like this. So the first thing we're going to do is strike some horizontal lines across the paper. I find that going horizontal is easier than going vertical. And honestly, you can always just turn your paper to make vertical lines. You don't have to make yourself paint vertically. None of these guidelines or exercises are meant to be hard and fast rules. So just take them as a way to have fun and to practice putting paint onto paper. So I'm going to hold my brush with not a very tight and not a very loose grip. It's an easy grip. So we want to be able to still have movement. I'm going to rest my palm, this part of my palm, on the paper as I'm doing this. I'm going to keep it down and keep my arm not heavy, but a bit light as we glide across the paper. By doing so, it's going to give me control of the brush and of my hand. So your job as you're gliding across the paper with the brush tip is to control the amount of pressure you're putting down on the hair as you're going across the paper. Let's do one stroke. One thing that I like to do is look at the edge of the top of my paper to help guide me whether or not I'm going straight or not. It really doesn't matter how straight or how crooked your lines are. At this point, they may be very wobbly. That is totally okay. They're probably not going to be quite as straight as mine, and I don't want you to feel worried about that. It's not often that we're going to be painting such straight lines like this. So this is really just about getting familiar with your brush and the paint and starting to really just get started, as I keep saying. It doesn't really matter how thin it is. You can practice yourself here to try and see how thin you can get it, which means your brush hairs are just going to barely touch the paper, and then start to drag your hand and see really how thin can you keep this line as you're going across. How lightly can you glide that brush across the paper? You can then do another line and put a little bit more pressure and let more of that hair rest on the paper, and then glide that across and then see how thick your line becomes. You can press, of course, all the way down if you'd like to, but we're going to do that in the next exercise. So for now, try to keep your lines as thin as possible. So just in case you were wondering, when are we going to press down and create thick lines? We'll do that in a second. So let's just make a few more thin lines. Again, really challenge yourself here to see how thin you can get them. And another thing you can challenge yourself with is how long can you drag this line? Mine is a 7-inch paper. It's likely you're not going to need to do such a long line, but if you're having trouble, you can break it apart. Do a little line first, and then lift your hand, and then put it back down. Do another one, and see how far you can go. And then do another one, and then do another one. You can even do short dashes just to see how it feels. And then start to notice, how are you feeling? How does your hand feel? Are you getting caught somewhere? Are you trying to only move your fingers and not your whole wrist? Because that's going to make a difference too. So let's do one more. You can do a whole page of these if you'd like. And then you can start to take different brushes also and try this with your other brushes as well. It's a really, really nice way to see how the tips of your brushes look. You know, how much snap do they have? How much water do they carry? Depending on your brush, you may run out of paint as you're making your stroke, depending on how long it is. That's going to give you an idea of how much water your brush holds. You're going to be able to see how nice of a point each brush gets. So if you have multiple brushes, definitely go and try that. So one thing that I think about brushes is that you're going to start to get a feel of how you use them and how they feel in your hand when you do these exercises. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this. This is really just a guideline to give you an exercise to do so that you can actually put some intentionality behind your strokes and what you're thinking about and what you're looking at, okay? So let's do another one. And once you've done a few horizontal lines, you can start to practice some vertical lines. So again, I'm just going to go back and pick up some paint. You can see that I'm not using that much paint because I'm not having to mix more. I just started with this little puddle and I'm still using this same puddle. So what I'm going to do here for the vertical lines is I don't really need to glide at this point, and we're not going to do vertical lines really, well, we can try and do vertical lines really long, but let's start by trying doing short vertical lines. So we're not going to move our wrist, we're just going to move our hands like this. We're going to start at the top, we'll move down, we'll move our fingers, and we'll move the brush, but our whole hand and wrist is not moving along the paper. You can see I lifted a little bit. So what happens here is when you first put this down, you're going to end up lifting. It kind of curves up like this. And that's just a movement that you can start to notice. It's going to be different for everybody. So let's do another one. Again, try to keep the pressure very light on the tip of your brush and see how it turns out. So I just noticed something that I did that I want to point out is that I actually started to glide a little bit as I went down. Let's do it again and see what I naturally do. So that is turning my fingers like this, and then keeping this really light. I'm noticing that even if I don't pick up my hand, I'm doing a little bit of this vertical gliding action just naturally. So that's something definitely to notice just about yourself. You know, we all have different ways of doing this. So if I just said use your fingers, but you want to glide, then that's definitely something you should listen to. Listen to your own muscle movements, how you naturally approach it, and do it that way. Another thing I want to show you here is we're not trying to make perfect lines. There's something really beautiful about this second line, kind of skips and changes. So keep that in mind as well. It's not wrong if you can't get it right. What it is telling you is that you can actually pick up these qualities and you might like them and you can use them later in your painting. You can just start to think about the aesthetics of these things. If you just are looking at it, you're like, hey, this looks really nice. You can make a mental note of it. You know, we don't want to be making all the same standard strokes all the way down. You know, maybe it's nice to have a little bit of variation. And I think that's what's beautiful about watercolor painting. Even in these simple strokes, we can see a lot of variation just because there's a difference in pressure. There's a human element of movement to it because we're the ones controlling this brush and we're not perfect and our movements aren't perfect and they create variation in these lines. So we can do a few more of these. Okay, you can try and challenge yourself again to see how thin you can make it or how consistent you can get it if you want it consistent. If you need to put a line down, pick it up, and then do it again, you can do that. I'm finding that I'm using my pinky as a kickstand, so you can see that when I'm doing these strokes.
So it's either being used to hold my hand down as an anchor or I'm actually gliding it across. So let's do a few longer verticals. My paint is starting to dry, just a note. I'm going to get a little bit of water on my brush and then just add a little bit of water here, grab a little bit of paint just to rehydrate my puddle. My puddle is starting to dry a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is use my pinky as a kickstand, and then I'm going to come and I'm going to pull a line down. So my whole hand is going to move like this. Actually, I'm going to turn it this way so you can see better. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to pull my line down. I want to make sure my paint is dry so I don't smear it. So let's see if we can glide our pan down. And we're also doing, I'm going to move my hand down a little bit too. It was up here and I'm finding that it's a little bit too tall or too high because I can't really comfortably rest my palm and make this mark. So I'm moving my hand down a little bit. So you can see there's a play between how much pressure we're putting and how little pressure. So if I'm trying to make a thin line, I start to back off on the brush, and sometimes it's too much and then it actually lifts off the paper. So I'm going to take my hand, I'm resting my palm, this curved side of my palm down, and using my pinky for stability, and then I'm pulling down with a super light touch. This one is so light that I've skipped around, and you can see I'm playing with how much am I actually pressing down on the brush as I'm moving. Let's do another. Another thing that you're going to end up practicing here is also how to reset your brush a little bit. Our brushes stay pretty pointed, especially if you're using synthetic or some sort of synthetic blend, but you might notice that it gets a little bit tilted, or if it's angled a little bit from your last stroke, you're gonna make a thicker stroke than you would have if you come back here and you sort of tap your brush and rotate a little bit to reset that tip. So you might see me doing that. So sometimes I do that just to reset the tip, kind of make it nice and sharp again before I come back and I do the next stroke. Now the strokes that we're making here are quite slow. They're very slow and methodical. Sometimes when we're painting, we want to move faster and it creates a different character. So I just want to point that out as you're practicing this. You know, you're going to think about how often are you actually going to make strokes like these when you're painting. Maybe you will because you'll have something that needs this kind of pattern or there's some element. But sometimes maybe you need something fast, like a flick, like a grass or a wire, something that really doesn't warrant doing a straight, steady line like this. So there's different applications for how you would see this happen when you're painting. You can kind of start to think about what these elements remind you of. Sometimes that's what happens. And you can start to think about what you might be painting that would require this kind of stroke. Those are kinds of the things I think about. Sometimes I think about what does it look like? What does it spark in my head visually? And think about, and just kind of let those thoughts come and go. I think that's what's so nice about putting paint onto paper is that you start to create visuals and you start to think and you start to have these references that come up in your mind as you're doing even just something as simple as a bunch of lines. Our next exercise is going to be very similar to our last exercise. This is for thick lines. So really it's going to be the same idea here. So you're going to make sure you still have a nice puddle of paint. So if you need to grab more of your paint to mix up your puddle again, get your brush nice and wet, but not drippy, then you're set to go. And what you're going to want to do this time is we're going to do horizontal lines first and then vertical lines after. And we're going to make really thick lines this time. So what we're going to be doing is pressing fully down onto what's called the belly of the brush, this part of the brush. You want the whole thing pressed down, and you're going to be able to make a really thick line. So you probably already sensed that if you were making thin lines, that we were keeping the brush off the paper as much as possible and letting just the tip touch the surface. Now we want to really let the entire thing touch the surface. We're going to take the full belly of the brush, press it down on the paper, and we're going to drag in that direction and then see what that looks like. You're just going to lift at the end. It's going to leave this little dot of paint that's going to be left over from your brush. Totally okay. You're also going to see that perhaps by the end you start to run out of paint. And that's going to tell you something about how much paint your brush can hold. If your brush, it doesn't hold that much paint, you might run out halfway through. It's not right or wrong. It's just how your tool is working. It might inform you about how often you might have to reload your brush. It might tell you, hey, I don't like this. I need to find a brush that holds more water. So it gives you a little bit of direction as to where you might want to go with it. You're also going to see how big of a stroke your brush can make. So mine is a size 10 and it makes a pretty big stroke. And if you think it's too big or too small, or you need to add a brush because you like how small or big mine is looking, then that's going to tell you something too. So just practicing these strokes tells us so much about the tools that we're currently using. You can tell that I have to load quite a bit more water to do this because I'm not relying just on the tip of the brush to make the mark. I'm relying on the entire belly of the brush to grab paint and go all the way across. So let's try it a different way. Right now we've been pressing down and then dragging in the same direction of the brush. What happens if we press this way, go the 90 degrees to what we were doing before? So we're going to press like this, and then we're going to glide all the way across like this. What kind of mark does that make? That makes a really interesting, nice, thick line. And you can see when I did this one, I actually had to change the angle of my hand. So instead of painting like this and then pressing down at a 90-degree angle, which wouldn't work well, I had to rotate my hand. The angle of my hand actually changed in order to make this mark. So instead of going like this, I had to turn my hand so that the brush was facing the 90 degrees to what it was doing before. I used my pinky as a kickstand. I pressed down, and then I dragged my entire wrist with my pinky across the paper. You can see this one made even more of a different mark, which is really a beautiful mark as well. It skips a little bit. It's not consistent all the way across. Again, so much of this is just the beauty of watercolors and watercolor brushes. So let's do one more this way. I like this second stroke. Let's do it like this. Pull all the way across. And then we're starting to get an effect called dry brush, which is really beautiful too. Not something that you have to dive into right now. Just keep that in mind. We'll be going over it later on. But you're already going to probably encounter watercolor techniques as you're getting into this. So that's a really beautiful thing as well. So let's just make strokes, not think too much about it. And now that we've done horizontal thick lines, let's do some vertical thick lines. And I'm going to start the same way by holding my brush this direction. And I'm going to go down and see how that looks. So I'm going to press down fully on the belly of the brush and then go all the way down like this. That makes an interesting mark. Let's go and do it again. This one was a much juicier brush because I didn't have as much of a dry mark at the end. So you're starting to hopefully see that how much you load your brush up with paint, that's going to show you how juicy your mark is going to be here, how long you can go. Perhaps if I went longer, it would end up running out. So I have a small piece of paper here, but if you have a big one, please feel free to experiment and go, keep on going. Just go and go and go until and see how much time it takes for you to run out of paint, just as an experiment. So let's do another one. And this time we're going to go this way. I forgot to press down all the way when I was starting. After I made this mark, I'm not going to reload my brush as an experiment. I would encourage you to do this too. Let's just see what happens. Do I run out of paint? Do I not? Let's see what happens with a brush that's already been used. Like all of that paint was taken out. It's still able to carry it over. So this brush, I would say, holds quite a bit of water. I would say do an experiment where you're doing another stroke with just keep going. Don't reload the brush. Let's do it here. And then see what happens. How long is it going to take to run out? We'll do it in the in-betweens. Still going. So this brush can hold a lot of water. I think this is a great experiment for you to do with your brush. It's starting to run out, and then as it starts to run out, you get this dry brush effect. And this is kind of a really fun, so you can see it gets less and less and less. You can also start to see other watercolor techniques come up too, like layering. You can see that there's a double line here happening. Just by practicing the strokes, you're going to start to visually see a lot of techniques that perhaps you don't know the names of yet, but we will get to. So this is such a fun exercise to do. So give this a try and have fun with trying to figure out how much your brush can hold, how long does it take for the paint to run out, and what effects you get once the paint starts to run out in your brush.
I hope that you found this video helpful. I know as a beginner it can be hard to know where to start and what to do next. If you enjoyed these exercises, here are a few more ideas for brush strokes that you can practice. If you have other brushes that are different shapes, I'd encourage you to pull those out and play around with them, and you could even come up with your own brushstroke exercises. Let's say you're feeling really comfortable with brush control and you want to move on to the next thing to practice. My recommendation would be to practice water control, so things like water to paint ratio and the stages of paper wetness. Now, if that sounds a little bit confusing or overwhelming and you want a little bit more guidance when it comes to learning the core foundational aspects of watercolor so that you can continue painting and exploring and having fun, you can always join the Paint With Me community. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.